So when I was 5 or 6 years old, my family went on a camping trip with my cousin's family. And one day I was taking the bike down to the beach, and there was this big gravel hill. The camping spot was up top of the hill, and the beach was down at the bottom. And as I was riding my bike down that gravel road, I wiped out. And my little 5-year-old body went sprawling across the rock. And since I was only wearing my swim trunks, I got a nasty case of road rash from my hip bone to my armpit. And when that happened, I was sure this was like the worst injury ever. I was certain that I was going to be disfigured for life, that I was going to need to make multiple trips to the hospital for treatment. At the very least, I figured I had the best show and tell for my summer vacation anybody was going to have. But my mom and my aunt picked the rock and the sand out of the wound. They took a damp towel and they wiped it down. They put bandages over the worst scrapes, gave me a children's Tylenol, and then they forgot all about it. And the weird thing is, by the end of that camping weekend, most of the wounds had scabbed over. Within a week, really all that was visible were the deepest cuts. About a month in, the only way you could tell I'd had an accident was the new skin was a little bit whiter than the rest of my tan skin. And today, some 40 plus years since that childhood accident, I don't have any scars at all. Given enough time, all my wounds healed. And so sometimes we're tempted to think that that's how it works for our emotional and our spiritual wounds as well. Given enough time, all our wounds heal. This study is called Misquoted. We're talking about things that we think are in the Bible but are not. These pet phrases and tired cliches that Christians have a tendency to quote with the authority as though they had come from Scripture. One of the reasons I think it's important to talk about these phrases is we have a tendency as Christians to insert them into emotionally charged conversations. I call some of these phrases verbal filler. That is, they're the sorts of things we use whenever there's a crack in our conversations. So imagine you've got a friend who's going through an emotionally trying time. Maybe they just found out that their parents have been diagnosed with a serious disease. Maybe their kids have been getting in trouble at school. Maybe they've got a job situation that's turned ugly. It's an emotional time. And then there's a pause, a crack in the conversation. And you want to be helpful, you want to be encouraging. More than anything, you'd like to, point them towards hope in God. So you reach for your trowel, and as the crack widens, you start to spackle it over with some verbal filler. It'll get better with time. This too shall pass. Just give it time. Just like my scrapes and cuts got better over time, we assume that our relational and emotional wounds can be healed given enough time. So this study is going to talk about some of the cliches we use, the time-related cliches when we're talking about grief. And to kind of collect them all into one idea, I'm going to use the phrase I'm sure you've all heard, time heals all wounds. It's a nice enough thought. I suppose it's hopeful in its own way, but let me assure you, this phrase is not found in the Bible. And I'm afraid it often brings more harm than good. So let's begin by asking if there's any biblical truth. Does the Bible teach anything that would adhere to the notion that time heals all wounds? And the short answer is no, not really. The Bible has some things to say about time, but it doesn't say anything about time healing our pain. Like God helps those who help themselves, that phrase, time heals all wounds, is believed to have come from ancient Greece. A playwright named Menander is credited as saying, time is the healer of all necessary evils. And in English, Geoffrey Chaucer, 1300s, is said to have said, as time him hurt, a time does him cure. From that point on, that phrase, time heals all wounds, has become a sort of accepted proverb in the English language. But it's not in the Bible. In fact, when the Bible talks about time, the thing it emphasizes is that our time is under the control of God. A representative verse might be Psalm 31, verse 15. It says, "My times are in your hands. Deliver me from the hands of my enemies, from those who pursue me." Biblically speaking, God knows the number of our days. He knows the plans He has for us in that time, and He wants us to make the most of the days that we have. Psalm 90, verse 12 says this, "Teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom." The more we understand that God is in control of time, the wiser and better use we can make of the time that we have. But about the passage of time healing our pain, or helping us in grief, the Bible has very little to say. So let's talk about where this saying goes wrong. You know, the funny thing is, as I was researching this phrase, I found that there are very few people who like it. In all of the reading I did, Christian and non-Christian alike, no one who commented on it finds the phrase all that helpful. I mean, think about it. If you've ever been in a situation where you've been experiencing acute grief and someone says to you, it'll get better with time, or just give it time. It raises all sorts of questions, doesn't it? Like, how much time? And if a significant amount of time has passed and I still don't feel better, does that mean there's something wrong with me? You know, that phrase, "time heals all wounds," in a lot of ways implies that we're going to give the person in grief so much time to feel sad, but then after that, and nobody knows exactly how long that is, that person needs to snap out of it or get over it. Rose Kennedy, mother of two assassinated sons, JFK and RFK, she's often quoted on this saying. She says this, "It's been said time heals all wounds. I do not agree. The wounds remain. In time, the mind, protecting its sanity, covers them with scar tissue and the pain lessens, but it never goes away." Time can create separation between the pain and where we are today. It can soften the pain to some extent, but time by itself can never heal that wound. Secular psychologists say that the grieving process is one we need to work through. We need to engage our grief. Just like you wouldn't sit around waiting for other problems to fix themselves, neither can you do that with your sorrow. An article I read in Psychology Today gave these examples. Said you have to look for a new job, you have to search for a new house, you have to study to get through school. Even if you're hoping to win the lottery, you've got to buy the ticket. There are certain actions that we need to take if we hope other actions are going to occur, and it's the same in working through the grieving process. Another article I read used the example of a flat tire. If you go out into your driveway, you see that your tire has a flat. You're not going to just stand around and wait for it to reinflate itself. I mean, if you do, you're going to stand there a long time. You have to take some initiative. You're going to have to call a mechanic. You're going to have to get an air can. You're going to have to put on the spare. Well, in the same way, if you find yourself in grief, there's a process. You need to engage that grief. You need to work through your feelings. Time does not heal all wounds. A more apt saying would be to say it's what we do with the time that heals. And I think that's a true idea. It's helpful in its own way. If you're a non-believer, when you're faced with grief, the best thing you can do is to engage the grieving process. And I think that's true for believers as well. You can't just wait for the passage of time to make everything better. You need to work through your feelings. But is that it? I mean, is that the best we can hope for? Which leads me to my third question. Is there better news in the gospel? If we reject the idea that the passage of time is the healer of all of our wounds, does the Bible offer something better? And the answer is yes, very much yes. The Bible says that rather than looking to the clock or looking to the calendar to heal our pain, we should look to God. One of the best ways we can work through our grief is to take our grief and give it to Him, because God, in His grace and in His love, can help to heal some of that pain that we're experiencing. Does the passage of time help God's grace go to work? Certainly it does, but by God's grace, even in the worst of times, we can find things to rejoice about. Frankly speaking, I'm not even sure healing wounds is the best way to talk about this. I lost my dad more than a decade ago now at an age I consider much too young. And I would not say that I'm over it or that wound is healed. And I wouldn't want to say that, because saying that sort of implies that I don't miss him anymore, or that I've stopped caring about him. I think the pain of losing my father is something I'm going to carry with me for the rest of my time here on earth. But the comfort comes from knowing that God walks in that pain with me. Look at Isaiah 61. This passage is one that Jesus quoted very early in his public ministry, and it's almost as though Jesus claims this as his mission statement, his purpose statement for why he came to earth. This is what he says: "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn." So look at those phrases. Jesus says, I came to bind up the brokenhearted. I came to comfort all who mourn. Jesus' purpose is to come and meet us in our pain. Those who are grieving, those who are experiencing sorrow, Jesus wants to pick up some of that burden and help us carry it. Isaiah 53, one of the best descriptions in the Bible of Jesus' ministry on the cross. Here's what it says: "He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we're healed." Jesus understands what it's like to hurt. Look at the description. He's a man of suffering. He's familiar with pain. One of Jesus' purposes in coming to earth was to experience the struggles that we experience. And somehow it's in his woundedness that we find healing. What I think that means is when we go through times of suffering, there's great comfort in knowing that someone who has been there, someone who's experienced some of the worst things the world has to offer, is ready and willing to walk with us through our pain. And so, instead of looking to time to heal our wounds, instead of expecting the passage of time to make everything better, we need to look to Jesus, who offers to walk with us and carry that burden with us. Whether your grief is just a couple of days old, or a couple of months, or a couple of years, or even a couple of decades, that wound may still have the power to hurt just as much as the day you received it. It's not the passage of time that's going to make a difference. But Jesus, one who has been there and experienced pain, invites us to look to him as the friend who will not leave us, as the friend who wants to stand with us. And so if there's one thing you take away from this study today, I want it to be this: time does not heal all wounds, but Jesus, the wounded healer, does. And he invites you. One of the best ways that for any of us to engage in the grieving process is to take our grief to him. So finally, I want to go back to that imaginary conversation I mentioned at the beginning. If you've ever been in that situation where you're talking with someone who's processing grief, you know that is one of the most difficult situations to know what to say that there is. And it's awful in the midst of that awkwardness that we'll throw out a phrase like, well, time heals all wounds. And so if we don't want to fall back onto tired cliches and empty phrases, what can we do in that situation? Well, as I was working on this, I came across an article by a woman named Victoria Strong. And when Victoria's daughter Gwendolyn was like 7 weeks old, she was diagnosed with a very rare and untreatable disease that would eventually take little Gwendolyn's life. Gwendolyn never learned to walk. She never learned to talk. Her parents lived nearly every day of her life with an acute awareness that she'd be taken from them far too soon. When Gwendolyn was about 8, she passed away. And so this article, Victoria has become someone who is working on finding a cure for that disease, but also someone who's helping people to understand what it's like to process grief. This article was about addressing the myth that time heals all wounds. And instead, Victoria gave some suggestions for things we can do when we're trying to walk with one another through the midst of pain. I thought these suggestions were helpful. So number 1, say names. Sometimes we're talking to somebody who's lost a loved one, and we're aware of that, and we feel like, well, if we bring it up, if we mention that person's name, we're just going to reopen that wound, or we're going to cause them pain that, maybe we're going to bring something up they haven't been thinking about. And Victoria says this. She says, whether it's been a month or 5 years or 10 years, speak of them. You aren't bringing up a sensitive topic or bad memories. There will never, ever be a day our child is not on our mind. Parents may cry hearing their child's name spoken aloud, but those types of tears are fresh glue to a broken heart that will never be fully mended. So don't be afraid to talk about the person who's gone. Or number 2, remember dates. Holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, the day that person died. On those days when you're aware that your friend is going to be thinking about the person they lost, again, it means so much to them if you can talk about it with them. You let them know you're thinking of them in the midst of their grief and their sorrow. Again, you're not reopening old wounds. They're going to be thinking about it. It's so good to know someone is aware of that. And then third, be there. Be there with no expectations. When we're going through grief, what we need is a friend who will stand with us and stick with us. And ultimately, Jesus is that friend. But as followers of Jesus, he's allowed us to stand in for him. He's invited us to represent him to one another. So just be there. Be there. No expectations. Just be there for your friend. Again, walking through grief is one of the hardest things any of us will do. And walking with a friend through grief is one of the things none of us feel adequate to. But we know the one, the wounded healer, the one who came to carry our sorrows and bear our burdens. And it's our privilege now to walk with one another through that grief.